What if I told you that somewhere in the depths of Prague, hidden in a basement that hasn't seen daylight for over 70 years, lies a mask so disturbing that it was banned by 3 different governments? A mask that doesn't just change your appearance, but forces everyone around you to share the same face. Today, we're diving into one of the most unsettling stories you've never heard. A tale that bridges the gap between science and nightmare. In 1943, during the height of World War II, while the world was consumed by chaos and destruction, a small team of scientists in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia stumbled upon something that would make them question the very nature of human identity. What they discovered wasn't just another weapon of war, but something far more sinister, something that could erase the fundamental concept of individuality itself. The story begins with Dr. Heinrich Volker, a German neurologist who had been experimenting with what he called perceptual manipulation. Volker believed that human recognition wasn't just about seeing faces, but about the brain's ability to process and categorize them. He theorized that if you could disrupt this process, you could essentially make people see whatever you wanted them to see. Working in a converted monastery outside Prague, Volker had access to dozens of unwilling subjects, prisoners who had been deemed expendable by the Nazi regime. But unlike other horrific experiments of that era, Volker wasn't interested in causing physical pain. He wanted to understand something much deeper, something about the nature of human perception itself. The breakthrough came when Volker discovered that certain patterns, when viewed at specific angles and lighting conditions, could trigger what he called facial synchronization. The human brain, when overwhelmed by these patterns, would essentially reset its facial recognition system, causing everyone in the immediate vicinity to appear identical to the observer. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Volker didn't just want to create an optical illusion. He wanted to make it permanent, using a combination of rare metals found only in the Bohemian Mountains and a technique he had learned from studying medieval alchemical texts. Volker began crafting what would become known as the conformity mask. The mask itself was a work of terrifying beauty, made from hammered silver and copper, inlaid with patterns that seemed to shift and move when you looked at them directly. But the most disturbing feature wasn't visible to the naked eye. Embedded within the metal were microscopic crystals that had been treated with a compound Volker had derived from a fungus found growing on human remains in the monastery's ancient catacombs. The first test subject was a young resistance fighter named Karel Novak, who had been captured trying to sabotage a German supply line. When they placed the mask on Karel's face, nothing seemed to happen at first. But then, slowly, the other prisoners in the room began to change. Not physically, but in the way they saw each other. One by one, they all started to see the same face looking back at them from every direction. Karel's face, but somehow universal, stripped of all individuality. The effect wasn't just visual. Within hours, the affected prisoners began to lose their sense of personal identity. They couldn't distinguish between themselves and others. They spoke in unison, moved in perfect synchronization, and worst of all, they seemed to share thoughts and emotions. They had become a collective consciousness, trapped in multiple bodies. But Volker had made a crucial miscalculation. The mask didn't just affect those who looked at the wearer, it affected the wearer as well. Karel, still wearing the mask, began to experience the consciousness of everyone in the room simultaneously. The human mind isn't designed to process multiple streams of consciousness at once, and Karel's sanity shattered within days. The other test subjects fared no better. Some clawed at their own faces, trying to find their original features beneath what they perceived as someone else's skin. Others sat motionless for hours, lost in the maze of shared consciousness that the mask had created. Within a week, 6 of the 8 test subjects had died from what appeared to be complete psychological breakdown. Volker, horrified by what he had created but unable to stop himself, continued his experiments. He discovered that the mask's effects could be transferred to other objects, clothing, jewelry, even photographs. Anyone who came into contact with these contaminated items would slowly begin to experience the same loss of individual identity, The final experiment took place on Christmas Eve, 1943. Volker decided to test the mask's effects on himself. Convinced that his superior intellect could withstand the psychological pressure, he was wrong. Within minutes of putting on the mask, Volker began screaming about seeing infinite versions of himself stretching into eternity. His assistants found him 3 days later, catatonic, the mask seemingly fused to his face. When Allied forces liberated the monastery in 1945, they found a scene of indescribable horror. 15 bodies, all bearing the same facial expression, all positioned in identical poses throughout the building. The mask was found in the basement laboratory, sitting on a pedestal surrounded by mirrors that reflected not the mask itself, but the face of everyone who had ever worn it simultaneously. The Allied command immediately classified the discovery as top secret. The mask was transported to a secure facility in London, where it underwent extensive testing by British intelligence. But every researcher who studied it for more than a few hours began showing signs of identity confusion. The project was shut down after a prominent scientist was found wandering the streets of London, insisting that everyone he met was actually himself. The mask was then passed between various government agencies, each hoping to understand its properties, each ultimately deciding it was too dangerous to study. The Soviet Union held it for 12 years, during which time several high-ranking officials reportedly suffered complete psychological breakdowns after brief exposure to it. The CIA kept it locked away for another decade before quietly transferring it back to Czechoslovakia in 1978 as part of a classified diplomatic exchange. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. According to declassified documents that surfaced only 5 years ago, the mask wasn't destroyed. It was buried in a lead-lined vault beneath Prague Castle, along with all of Volker's research notes and the contaminated items from his laboratory. The vault was sealed with concrete and steel, and according to the documents, it's still there. Local urban explorers have reported strange experiences in the tunnels beneath Prague Castle. People who venture too close to the sealed section report seeing the same face in every mirror, every reflection, every photograph they encounter for days afterward. Some claim to have found entrance points to the deeper tunnels, but none have ever returned with proof, and several have been found days later, wandering the city streets, unable to recognize their own reflection. The most chilling detail in the declassified files is a note written by the last researcher to study the mask. Before it was buried, he wrote, "The mask doesn't change faces, it reveals the truth that we are all the same underneath. But humanity isn't ready for that truth. We need our individual identities to function, to love, to exist as separate beings." The mask strips away the illusion of uniqueness and shows us the terrifying reality of collective existence. God help us if it ever sees daylight again. Some say that on quiet nights in Prague, you can still hear echoes from deep beneath the castle, the sound of multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, asking the same question over and over: who am I? Who am I? Who am I? The conformity mask remains one of the most disturbing artifacts of human experimentation, a reminder that in our quest to understand consciousness and identity, we sometimes discover truths too terrible for the human mind to bear. Whether it still lies buried beneath Prague Castle or has found its way back into the world remains unknown. But perhaps that's for the best. After all, in a world where individuality is already under constant threat, do we really want to find out what happens when the last barriers between self and other finally fall away? The next time you look in a mirror and see your own unique face staring back, remember the story of the conformity mask and be grateful that you can still tell the difference between yourself and everyone else. Because somewhere out there, buried in the darkness beneath one of Europe's most beautiful cities, lies proof that the line between individual and collective consciousness is far thinner than we'd like to believe. And if you ever find yourself in Prague, walking through the ancient tunnels beneath the castle, and you start to notice that everyone around you looks strangely familiar, that every face seems to be the same face, then you might want to turn around and run, because some discoveries are too dangerous to make twice, and some masks are better left buried in the darkness where they belong.